Hey guys, tonight we're going to gently wander into one of the loudest, angriest, most emotionally dramatic breakups in American history, and we're going to do it very quietly. So, dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe pretend you are sitting on a slightly creaky wooden porch in 1860. There's distant thunder. Or maybe that's just politics. Either way, tonight, we begin with a country that insisted it was united, and then very much was not. The American Civil War, or, as it could also be called, 4 years of everyone yelling. Now, before cannons start booming, don't worry, we won't boom anything loudly, we need to ease into this, because wars don't just pop out of nowhere. They simmer, they stew, they sit in the political crock-pot for decades, getting more uncomfortable by the year. And the big issue? Slavery. Yes, that word. The one that sat like a loaded cannon in the center of American politics from the very beginning. When the United States was founded in 1776, it was already carrying a contradiction the size of a plantation. The Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, while millions of enslaved people were very obviously not treated as equal. This wasn't an accident. It was a compromise, a very tense, very uneasy, let's not deal with this right now compromise. And as history teaches us, nothing ages better than unresolved moral contradictions. In the early 1800s, the United States kept expanding westward, new territories, new states, and every time a new state wanted in, Congress had to ask the same awkward dinner party question: free state or slave state? Because the balance mattered. If there were more slave states than free states, the South had more power in Congress. If there were more free states, the North gained leverage. So every admission to the Union became a miniature crisis. In 1820, they tried to calm things down with the Missouri Compromise. Missouri could enter as a slave state, Maine would enter as a free state, and there would be a line drawn across the map. Above it, slavery was banned in new territories. Below it, it was allowed. It was a political bandage, a very neat, straight-line bandage. And like most neat, straight-line bandages, it didn't hold forever. Let's drift forward a few decades. By the 1850s, tensions were rising like humidity before a summer storm. The North and South weren't just disagreeing about slavery, they were developing into two very different societies. The North was industrializing, factories, railroads, cities, immigrant labor, wage work. The South remained mostly agricultural, large plantations, cotton exports, an economy deeply dependent on enslaved labor. And cotton was king. Actually, cotton was so profitable that Southern leaders felt almost invincible. Europe depended on Southern cotton, especially Britain. So some Southerners believed if conflict ever came, European powers would step in to protect their precious textile supplies. Spoiler, they were a little optimistic. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North were becoming louder. Not everyone in the North opposed slavery, far from it, but anti-slavery movements were growing. And then came a book. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. It depicted the brutal realities of slavery in emotional, human terms. It became wildly popular. Suddenly, slavery wasn't just a distant political issue, it was a moral horror people could visualize. Southern leaders were not amused. They accused the North of exaggeration, of propaganda, of meddling. And as if that wasn't enough, Congress decided to pour gasoline on everything with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Instead of sticking to that tidy Missouri Compromise line, this act said new territories could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Popular sovereignty, they called it. which sounds very democratic until you realized it meant pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas to try to influence the vote. What followed was Bleeding Kansas, not a nickname you earn for calm town hall meetings. There were violent clashes, armed groups, mini-civil wars inside a territory that hadn't even become a state yet. It was a preview, a trailer for the main feature. And then there was John Brown. John Brown. In 1859, this radical abolitionist decided subtle political activism was not his thing. So he led a raid on a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to start a slave uprising. It did not go as planned. Brown was captured and executed, but in the North, many saw him as a martyr. In the South, he was proof that abolitionists were dangerous fanatics. Trust was dissolving. Now, let's glide into 1860, the election. Enter Abraham Lincoln. He was not at this point calling for immediate abolition everywhere, but he opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. For Southern leaders, that was enough. Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, which told the South something very uncomfortable. They were losing national influence. And so, one by one, Southern states began to leave the Union. South Carolina went first in December 1860. Others followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. They formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, and they elected Jefferson Davis as their president. And just like that, the United States had 2 presidents, which is usually not ideal for national unity. Now here's the thing. Lincoln did not initially march south with an army screaming, "Let's fight." He insisted the Union was perpetual. States couldn't just leave because they were upset. The Confederacy insisted they absolutely could. So the question became, who would blink first? That brings us gently to Fort Sumter, April 1861, a small federal fort in Charleston Harbor. It remained under Union control even though South Carolina had seceded. Confederate forces demanded its surrender. The Union hesitated. And then, in the early morning hours of April 12th, Confederate cannons opened fire. Boom. The Civil War had begun, and it would last 4 years. Now, as we settle into the early war, it's important to understand something. Almost everyone thought it would be quick, short, decisive, over by Christmas. Because of course they did. The North had advantages: more population, more industry, more ships, more economy. The South had advantages too: experienced military leaders, defensive territory, and a population fiercely committed to its cause. And cotton was king. Actually, cotton was so profitable that Southern leaders felt almost invincible. Europe depended on Southern cotton, especially Britain. So some Southerners believed if conflict ever came, European powers would step in to protect their precious textile supplies. Spoiler, they were a little optimistic. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North were becoming louder. Not everyone in the North opposed slavery, far from it, but anti-slavery movements were growing. And then came a book. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. It depicted the brutal realities of slavery in emotional, human terms. It became wildly popular. Suddenly, slavery wasn't just a distant political issue, it was a moral horror people could visualize. Southern leaders were not amused. They accused the North of exaggeration, of propaganda, of meddling. And as if that wasn't enough, Congress decided to pour gasoline on everything with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Instead of sticking to that tidy Missouri Compromise line, this act said new territories could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Popular sovereignty, they called it. which sounds very democratic until you realized it meant pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas to try to influence the vote. What followed was Bleeding Kansas, not a nickname you earn for calm town hall meetings. There were violent clashes, armed groups, mini-civil wars inside a territory that hadn't even become a state yet. It was a preview, a trailer for the main feature. And then there was John Brown. John Brown. In 1859, this radical abolitionist decided subtle political activism was not his thing. So he led a raid on a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to start a slave uprising. It did not go as planned. Brown was captured and executed, but in the North, many saw him as a martyr. In the South, he was proof that abolitionists were dangerous fanatics. Trust was dissolving. Now, let's glide into 1860, the election. Enter Abraham Lincoln. He was not at this point calling for immediate abolition. All right, welcome back. If you're still cozy, good. If you drifted off somewhere around Fort Sumter, honestly, that's kind of the goal. Tonight, we're easing into the middle stretch of the American Civil War. The part where everyone realizes this is not, in fact, a 3-month disagreement with uniforms. By 1862 and 1863, optimism had quietly packed its bags and left the continent. The North had expected a swift show of force. The South had expected a heroic defense and maybe some European sympathy. What both sides got instead was exhaustion. Let's float first to the Union side. President Abraham Lincoln was aging in dog years. Every photograph of him from 1860 to 1864 looked like someone slowly adjusted the haunted setting upward. The pressure was immense. Casualty lists were long. Newspapers were loud. Politicians were louder. And Union generals? Well, Lincoln went through them like someone trying to find a decent pillow. General George McClellan, for instance, was excellent at organizing troops, absolutely loved building a beautiful, well-drilled army. What he did not love was using it. He consistently overestimated Confederate numbers. Every time he prepared to attack, he believed he was outnumbered. He often wasn't, but he felt outnumbered. And feelings, as we know, can be very persuasive. Lincoln grew impatient. There are letters where you can practically hear him sighing through the ink. Meanwhile, in the Confederacy, things were complicated in a different way. Jefferson Davis had his own headaches. The South valued states' rights very strongly, so when the Confederate government tried to centralize authority for the sake of fighting a war, individual states sometimes pushed back. It turns out running a rebellion while insisting on minimal federal control can get messy. But the South did have something powerful in the early years: military leadership. General Robert E. Lee became the Confederacy's most famous commander. Calm, bold, devoutly loyal to Virginia. He declined command of Union forces because he would not fight against his home state. Lee took big risks. Sometimes they paid off, sometimes they absolutely did not. Now let's gently hover over daily life, because wars are not just generals and maps. They are hunger, waiting, letters that may or may not arrive. In the North, industry ramped up dramatically. Factories produced weapons, uniforms, rail supplies. The war effort stimulated economic growth, though it also created inflation and draft resentment. Yes, the draft. In 1863, the Union introduced conscription. If you were eligible and wealthy enough, you could pay for a substitute to take your place. This did not feel fair to working-class men. In New York City, draft riots broke out, violent ones. The city burned for days, and tragically, Black citizens were targeted in horrific acts of racial violence. Even in the Union, which now fought against slavery, racism was deeply embedded. The Confederacy introduced a draft and similarly allowed exemptions for certain wealthy individuals, including plantation owners, because nothing says shared sacrifice like you fight while I supervise. As the war dragged on, Southern civilians began to feel the strain far more intensely. The Union Navy established a blockade, cutting off Southern ports. This Anaconda Plan, as it was nicknamed, aimed to squeeze the Confederacy economically. And slowly, painfully, it worked. Supplies dwindled, inflation soared, food shortages became common. Southern women, many of whom had never managed plantations alone before, suddenly found themselves overseeing farms with limited labor and constant uncertainty. And enslaved people? They were watching carefully. As Union forces advanced into Southern territory, enslaved individuals fled plantations whenever possible. Each Union victory meant more freedom in practical terms. Let's drift now to 1863. Gettysburg had just bruised the Confederacy's ambitions in the North. Around the same time, in the West, Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi. That victory split the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River. This was huge. The South was now geographically fractured. Grant had a reputation. He was not flashy. He did not hesitate endlessly. He was willing to endure heavy casualties if it meant steady progress. Some criticized him for that. They called him a butcher. But Lincoln saw something else, a general who kept moving forward. And forward momentum by 1864 was exactly what the Union needed. That year, Grant was promoted to overall commander of Union forces, and he adopted a strategy of coordinated pressure. Instead of isolated campaigns, Union armies would push simultaneously. No more letting Confederate forces regroup comfortably. In the East, Grant engaged Lee in a brutal series of battles known as the Overland Campaign. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. The names themselves sound tired. Casualties were staggering. These were not elegant maneuvers. They were grinding, attritional clashes. Grant's approach was simple, if harsh: keep fighting. The Union could replace losses more easily than the Confederacy could replenish manpower. Lee could win tactical battles, but he could not replenish manpower at the same rate. Meanwhile, in the West, William Tecumseh Sherman prepared for his most infamous move. Let's float down to Georgia. Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864. This was a major symbolic and logistical blow to the Confederacy. Then he did something bold. He marched to the sea. Sherman's march to the sea was a campaign of destruction. Railroads were torn up, infrastructure was burned, crops were destroyed. The idea was to break the South's will to fight by targeting not just armies, but the economic backbone supporting them. It was psychological warfare as much as military strategy. Southern civilians experienced this as terrifying and devastating. Entire towns were upended. Sherman believed shortening the war would ultimately reduce overall suffering. History debates that logic endlessly. Now, while armies clashed and cities burned, politics continued humming in the background. 1864 was an election year. Yes, in the middle of a civil war. Lincoln faced re-election, and for a time it looked uncertain. War fatigue was real. Casualties were mounting. Some Northern voters wanted peace negotiations. Lincoln himself privately believed he might lose. But the capture of Atlanta shifted public morale. Union victories suggested the war might actually be winnable. Lincoln won re-election in November 1864, which meant the Union would continue fighting until unconditional victory. No negotiated reunion, no compromise that preserved slavery. The Confederacy, by this point, was struggling severely. Supplies were scarce, soldiers were deserting, infrastructure was collapsing, And in a moment of irony almost too heavy to carry, the Confederate government began discussing the possibility of arming enslaved men in exchange for freedom. The very system they fought to protect was crumbling under necessity. It was too little, too late. Let's slowly approach 1865. Union forces tightened their grip around Richmond, the Confederate capital. Grant and Lee faced each other in trench warfare around Petersburg. It resembled, in eerie ways, the static lines that would define World War I decades later. Mud, trenches, snipers, long stalemates. Lee's army was shrinking, starving, worn down. And finally, in April 1865, Richmond fell. Lee retreated westward, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces. He did not make it far. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. The terms were surprisingly generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home, officers could keep their sidearms, horses could be taken for spring planting. Grant wanted reconciliation, not humiliation. After 4 years, over 600,000 dead, a nation physically and emotionally shattered. It ended quietly, in a parlor, with signatures. But even as relief washed over the North, tragedy was not finished. 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater, and there he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The war had ended, the peace had barely begun, and the country lost the man who might have guided it most gently through what came next. We'll drift into that next time, because the war may have ended in 1865, but the consequences were only beginning. Reconstruction, freedom.
All right, we're back. The cannons have gone quiet. The smoke has drifted off into the soft spring air of 1865. And if you're listening from the comfort of your bed, congratulations. You've survived the loudest argument in American history. But here's the thing about civil wars. They don't really end when the shooting stops. They just change shape. So let's gently step into the fragile calm after Appomattox. Abraham Lincoln had spoken about malice toward none and charity for all. He wanted reconciliation, a soft landing, a way to bring the South back without endless punishment. 5 days later, he was gone. Vice President Andrew Johnson stepped into the presidency, and Andrew Johnson was complicated. He was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who had stayed loyal to the Union, which made him politically useful. But he was also deeply racist and strongly opposed to giving formerly enslaved people meaningful political power. This combination would matter a lot. Now, remember what the war had just done. 4 million enslaved people were legally free. All right, we're back. The cannons have gone quiet. The smoke has drifted off into the soft spring air of 1865. And if you're listening from the comfort of your bed, congratulations. You've survived the loudest argument in American history. But here's the thing about civil wars. They don't really end when the shooting stops. They just change shape. So let's gently step into the fragile calm after Appomattox. Abraham Lincoln had spoken about malice toward none and charity for all. He wanted reconciliation, a soft landing, a way to bring the South back without endless punishment. 5 days later, he was gone. Vice President Andrew Johnson stepped into the presidency, and Andrew Johnson was complicated. He was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who had stayed loyal to the Union, which made him politically useful. But he was also deeply racist and strongly opposed to giving formerly enslaved people meaningful political power. This combination would matter a lot. Now, remember what the war had just done. 4 million enslaved people were legally free. That is not a small social adjustment. It is a tectonic shift. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, officially abolishing slavery in the United States. And for a moment, just a brief, shimmering moment, it looked like the country might truly rebuild on new moral ground. Let's float through that moment. Freedmen and freedwomen began searching for lost family members. Slavery had torn families apart for generations. Now, with freedom, people placed newspaper ads, traveled across states, followed rumors. Some reunions happened. Many did not. The federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. It provided food, schools, medical care, and assistance negotiating labor contracts. Schools, especially, became powerful symbols. Literacy had often been forbidden under slavery. Now, education represented possibility. And for a few years during Reconstruction, Black Americans voted. They held office. They helped write new state constitutions in the South. It was, quietly, revolutionary. But it was also fiercely resisted. Southern white elites were not particularly thrilled about losing both a war and their entire labor system. So they began crafting black codes. These laws restricted the freedoms of formerly enslaved people, limited where they could work, where they could live, required labor contracts that looked suspiciously like the old system in new clothing. The North noticed, and Congress, especially the radical Republicans, decided President Johnson was being far too gentle with the former Confederacy. Johnson quickly pardoned many former Confederate leaders. He allowed Southern states to rejoin the Union with relatively few requirements beyond ratifying the 13th Amendment. Radical Republicans wanted more. They wanted protections for Black citizens, full civil rights, guarantees of voting rights. So Congress passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to anyone born in the United States, and then the 15th Amendment in 1870, prohibiting denial of the vote based on race. On paper, this was extraordinary progress. On the ground, it was contested. Violent groups emerged. The most infamous was the Ku Klux Klan. They used terror to suppress Black political participation, intimidation, night raids, violence meant to send a message. Reconstruction governments in the South struggled to enforce new laws while facing both economic devastation and organized resistance. Meanwhile, in the North, fatigue was setting in. Sound familiar? War fatigue had turned into Reconstruction fatigue. Many white Northerners who had supported ending slavery were less enthusiastic about long-term federal enforcement of racial equality in the South, and so political will began to fade. Let's drift gently toward the 1870s. Economic troubles hit. The Panic of '73 caused a severe depression. Financial crises have a way of pulling attention away from moral projects. Southern Democrats, calling themselves redeemers, worked to regain political control of Southern states. They campaigned on restoring home rule, which sounds pleasant until you realize home rule often meant rolling back Black political gains. Federal troops had been stationed in the South to enforce Reconstruction laws, but in 1877, as part of a political compromise that resolved a disputed presidential election, those troops were withdrawn. Reconstruction effectively ended, and without federal enforcement, Southern states began constructing a new system of racial control. Jim Crow laws segregated public spaces. Voting restrictions like literacy tests and poll taxes disenfranchised Black citizens. The promises of Reconstruction dimmed. Not erased entirely, but dimmed. Now, here's the part of history that gets very quiet and very important. The Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end racism. It did not guarantee equality. It did not magically undo centuries of exploitation. Instead, it created a new phase of struggle. For decades after 1865, the memory of the war itself was contested. In the South, a narrative known as the Lost Cause emerged. It framed the Confederacy as noble, minimized the role of slavery, emphasized states' rights and valor. Monuments were built. Myths were polished. In the North, memory softened too. Reconciliation between white Northerners and white Southerners often came at the expense of acknowledging black rights. The war became, in some retellings, a tragic family quarrel rather than a conflict over human bondage. History, as always, depends on who is telling it. But let's step back for a moment. The Civil War cost more American lives than any other conflict in the nation's history. Over 600,000 dead. Some estimates place it higher. Entire towns lost generations of men. It transformed the federal government, expanding its power permanently. It ended slavery as a legal institution. It reshaped the Constitution with 3 monumental amendments. It defined the idea that the United States was one nation, not a loose collection of states that could casually leave when upset. That question was settled at enormous cost. Now let's drift gently into something quieter. Imagine an ordinary family in 1866. Perhaps they lost a son at Gettysburg. Perhaps they were once enslaved and are now trying to negotiate wages for the first time. Perhaps they are former Confederates returning to farms that are half destroyed. Life continues. Crops must be planted. Children must be fed. Schools must be built, roads repaired. The drama of war gives way to the slow grind of rebuilding. And over time, the war becomes memory, then legend, then textbook, then YouTube video you're listening to while half asleep. There's something strangely human about that, because at its core, the Civil War was not just about abstract principles, it was about fear. The South feared losing its economic system and social hierarchy. The North feared the nation would fracture permanently. Enslaved people feared continued bondage and hoped fiercely for freedom. Leaders made decisions, some brave, some stubborn, some tragically short-sighted, and ordinary people paid the price. If we strip away the uniforms and speeches, what remains is a story about a country wrestling with its own contradictions. It declared liberty while practicing slavery. It proclaimed unity while tolerating deep division. And eventually, those contradictions erupted. Slowly, then all at once. But here's the gentle irony. The Civil War emerged from the Civil War more centralized, more industrial, and more powerful than before. The very conflict that nearly tore it apart ended up accelerating its transformation.